The glass gardens of Winterfell were destroyed by Ramsay Bolton when he sacked the castle, and I really think that someone should rebuild them before winter falls. The reason that it would be good to have a greenhouse at Winterfell throughout the winter is obviously the small supply of food that it would provide, and any little bit helps, but it's not that simple because it's very difficult and costly to replace glass in Westeros. Jon even thinks about building a greenhouse at the Wall at one point, and so it's on his mind how expensive it would be. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the potential repairing of these glass gardens, and why it might in the end be even more useful than we could possibly have imagined. Now, I think it's worth noting that while the glass gardens in Winterfell are likely the most impressive of the greenhouses, George has specifically said in an interview at one point that yes, the other Lords of the North, some of them at least, do maintain their own greenhouses, and as I said, Jon thinks about building a new greenhouse at the Wall, so the idea of building a greenhouse, or at the very least repairing one, is something that would be technically possible in Westeros, and is even on Jon's mind when he thinks about how if they had the coin for it, he would hire glassblowers from the free cities, and bring them over and have them teach the trade to people, but in the end the Watch has no coin, so he can't do that. So the glass gardens were brought up early in Book 1, they were established, and they keep being brought up in subsequent books, in their destruction, in our characters thinking back and reflecting about them. It happens a lot, so this is something that George does keep reminding us of. Now, he could be reminding us for the obvious reason that winter is coming and it's going to be very annoying to not have the glass gardens, to not have greenhouses, to not have enough food throughout the winds of winter, which is seemingly a thing that I think we should expect, right? There's been a lot of food descriptions throughout this book, and I'd imagine in Winds of Winter, there's going to be a lot of descriptions where there is not a lot of food. So Ramsay's destruction of the Great Glass Garden seems like it is one of his most short-sighted, if not one of his more evil decisions, right? He's done more that's a lot more evil than that, but there's not a lot of things that are as stupid and pointless as destroying the greenhouse of the castle that you are moving into just for funsies. Like, especially with winter coming, that is just like one of the worst strategic moves I would say that Ramsay could have possibly made if they're going to take over Winterfell. Now, granted, he may not have been thinking all the way through and may not have expected to actually end up in charge of Winterfell at the time of the sacking of the Great Glass Gardens, but in any case, I could see a situation where whoever's in charge of Winterfell is sitting here staring at this, wishing they had the ability to get more glass. Now, when Jon thinks about the idea of getting new glass at the Wall, as I mentioned, he mentions that they don't have enough gold, but if they did, they could hire glass blowers from the free cities. Another one of the problems, even if they were able to get glass blowers, is the fact that it is very resource intensive to build fires hot enough in medieval times to create the glass, so you would have to chop down a lot of trees and use a lot of firewood that could otherwise be used to keep people warm during the winter or cook food or anything like that. So there's a lot of resources and a lot of costs that would go into the repairing of these gardens. Now, if you have watched some of my recent theory videos, what I've talked a little bit about recently is how it seems like we are building up for a cycle of rebirth, and how the old World Tree Weirwood system seems to be old and on its last legs, and that seems like one of the things that will likely be going by the end of the story, and there might need to be a time of rebirth for a new World Tree. I do also think that it makes a little bit of sense that if the heart tree is functioning like a heartbeat of the planet as the world tree, and it is the thing that cycles the seasons, the reason that the seasons have been irregular is because the world tree was corrupted by blood magic, and once the world tree dies, I could see that being the thing that kicks off the long night, because the seasons can no longer cycle because the heart tree is dead. There's no more heartbeat of the seasons because there's no more heart tree. So to end the long night and restart the cycle of the seasons, it would make sense then that you may need to somehow grow a new world tree. So obviously, if you are sitting here in the middle of winter needing to grow a plant to solve this issue, what would be a better place to do that than the Great Glass Gardens of Winterfell, which can supposedly grow plants all the way through the coldest of winters? So if the glass gardens were still in their working condition, it would probably be pretty straightforward then, wouldn't it? I mean, you have everyone, when the long night falls, potentially huddling into their castles, huddling into places like Winterfell, and potentially Bran and many of our main characters may be pushed and centered into Winterfell by this point, and wondering what the heck to do. How are they going to solve this? The old world tree has died or is about to die. And then up shows, finally, Howland Reed, who has met the Green Men and is aware of his role in this whole entire process, which is to help deliver, potentially, whatever sapling or whatever seed has been stored for a new world tree on the Isle of Faces, which is a thing that I think is probably part of why the Isle of Faces was put there. The Order of the Green Hand and the Green Men of the Isle of Faces are likely there to guard green magic secrets, the old creation magic, the stuff that was done in the time of Bran the Builder and Garth the Green when the new age was building, and that's what I think is going to be needed at the cycling and rebirth of this age. And as someone pointed out in the comments of the video when I mentioned that, if Howland Reed has actually been told that his entire role in this whole thing is, hey, you need to be there when everything goes really bad and deliver this magical tree sapling to Winterfell, where it can be planted as a new world tree, well then, that would kind of make sense of him staying out of the way this entire time, wouldn't it? Because he can't show up until the exact right moment. Potentially, that could be something that was told to him by the Green Men, and, as we talked about last episode, potentially, that could have even been told to him, if you go all the way back to the top, by the time-traveling Bran, or by the Weirwoods themselves, whoever you want to believe is in charge of the whole thing in the end. But in any case, if we are doing the whole, Norse mythology cycle of rebirth by ice and fire that A Song of Ice and Fire seems to be, it would really make sense that the world tree is also going to go through a cycle of rebirth, and yeah, I do think that that is probably going to end up being the thing that Howland Reed is hanging out and waiting for the right moment to show up and explain, along with, potentially some of the other important information he has. But, in the end, as the television show kind of showed us, do you really need Howland Reed to come and show us Jon's parentage? Are there other ways to see that? Does that even really matter in the end? Would anyone believe Howland Reed who matters, right? I could see it mattering in the books if Howland shows up with that information, but if Howland's main actual purpose, because if the idea that Jon is a Targaryen doesn't, magically solve every problem in the story, which it doesn't seem like it will, what could actually magically solve every problem in the story is this rebirth into a new age of green magic. So, if Howland's actual main plot purpose is to show up with this green man knowledge and help facilitate a birth of a new world tree with this cycling of ice and fire, well, they took all of that out of the television show, and therefore that's possibly why they just completely took Howland Reed out of the television show, and why he never showed up in the end, because the plotline that he was helping resolve is just non-existent. So if George wants to take it, it would seem he has the setup for the idea to rebirth a world tree using this green magic knowledge, potentially with the help of Howland Reed showing up at Winterfell at the right moment, and he has Jon, who, if the television show is to be believed, could eventually end up in charge of Winterfell, who is very aware of the usefulness of the glass gardens, and thinks about how good it would be to have them for winter. So, from the very beginning of the books, they are established as very useful, and all the way through the books, we are being reminded that, oh yeah, the characters are thinking about these glass gardens and how good they are to have. And one of the very interesting things about the glass gardens that happens in the early books is that Bran remembers that there's a man who gives Bran a blackberry every time he visits the garden, which is kind of a weird little detail to imagine, right? That there's just a guy who every time he sees Bran, he's like, here's one blackberry, and then that Bran doesn't know the guy's name, when he seems to be, listing all of the people that he knows throughout the castle, then all of a sudden he thinks of this guy as just the man who gives him a blackberry, which is possibly just the case that, he's thinking, because he does also refer to in his mind, the gardeners, and he doesn't think of, each individual gardener's names when he remembers, the gardeners that he would watch tend to vegetables in the glass gardens, so it's possible the Blackberry Man is just one of these unnamed gardeners who Bran doesn't really get to know. But the interesting thing is, why is it a blackberry? Why is Bran given a blackberry, and why are blackberries associated with the glass gardens? And you have to be careful when you're trying to look for symbolic clues like this, because, as just a little bit of searching for the symbolism of blackberries will remind you, a lot of different cultures take a lot of different meanings from all of the same symbols. So when you look up what blackberries have been symbolized to mean in different cultures, it's basically everything. There's just a long, long list. but there are a few that kinda stick out, and could be what George is going for when he's establishing the connection of a blackberry to the Great Glass Gardens. Blackberries are often used as a symbol of abundance, and therefore it could just be showing that the Starks are having an abundant harvest, that Winterfell is very prosperous, that the Glass Gardens, that everything is going well, so that could be why Bran is given a blackberry, just to show the prosperity. However, blackberries are also sometimes used as a symbol of magical protection, which could be hinting at the idea that Winterfell is a giant magically warded structure. So you can see there's like different little meanings for different cultures that could all fit. However, the one that stands out the most in this context, and what I think maybe George was going for, with hinting that the blackberry is given to Bran in the Glass Gardens, is that blackberries are often a symbol of renewal and rebirth. I'm going to have the article that I was looking at about blackberries, and this specific section of it up on the screen right now, because just look at a lot of the way that they describe this, and tell me this doesn't fit with what it seems like George is going for here. It says that they are often seen as a symbol of rebirth due to their life cycle, in which they start out as a small green bud before they grow large and get purple or black, which kind of fits with the magic system in Westeros, right? It starts out as green magic, and eventually grows larger and darker, and it's now ended up as blood and shadow magic, so it's kind of going through the same life cycle as a blackberry in a weird little way. So if you view the way that magic has been used in the world over this era as a similar life cycle to a blackberry, needing to go through a rebirth of green magic, and specifically needing to do so at the Glass Gardens of Winterfell in the end, then having Bran be given a blackberry every time he goes to the Glass Gardens seems like a good little bit of foreshadowing from George. It's also worth noting that the next two meanings of blackberries listed right next to this with the transformation and rebirth section is also about how they are there for purification and transcendence or spiritual awakening, definitely things which Bran has undergone, and if his end journey also brings him back to the Great Glass Gardens of Winterfell, it could again be more foreshadowing, and again, even if it doesn't, I suppose it could all just be foreshadowing for the fact that Bran is going to go on this great awakening spiritual journey, right? So this is, again, why it's very difficult to pick apart symbolism and figure out exactly what George is going for, because you can just look at, 20 different symbolisms for blackberries, and 6 or 7 of them kind of fit with what it seems like he's doing. So it's tough to say how much he's actually going for and how much is just coincidence, but if this is indeed what the Glass Gardens are used for in the end, I think that specifically what I'm showing you here is a very, very strong connection for a potential reason why George would choose a blackberry. That's why these things can be sort of difficult to get to the bottom of, right? You can't just notice the symbolism and be like, oh, well, blackberries are about transcendence and rebirth, and therefore, definitely what's going to happen is they're going to use the Great Glass Gardens for some sort of rebirth. Because if that was the only evidence, well, that wouldn't be a very strong theory. The reason that I came to the conclusion is all of the textual evidence that seems to be pointing towards a cycle of rebirth, and then how useful the Great Glass Gardens would seem to be for trying to rebirth a world tree in the middle of the long night. And then once you look at that, and you have this whole thing where a bunch of stuff is pointing to that, and then you look at the blackberry, and then you realize, oh, blackberries are about transcendence and rebirth. It strengthens the theory. It can't be the basis for the theory, though, right? That's kind of how I view symbolism and stuff like that, just to let you know how I think about these things a little bit. I did not see the blackberry and think oh, this is an important part of the theory. I put together the rest of the theory, and then I was like, oh, hey, now that kind of makes sense of that blackberry man now, doesn't it? So, once you see that George seems to be going in a direction with some textual evidence and a lot of hints, and then you go back and find some symbolism that lines up, to me, that's a good point where you can marry the two and say, hey, everyone, look at this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, hey everyone, look at that blackberry man in the context of a cycle of rebirth that may need to happen. So now, hopefully we have established the usefulness of the Great Glass Gardens for the coming winter and potentially for the long night. Whether you're on board with me for the rebirth of the World Tree or not, they just seem like they'd be very useful, and Jon himself thinks about building new glass gardens, so when he gets to Winterfell, it might be top of his mind to try rebuild the glass gardens. So will it be possible to rebuild Winterfell's glass gardens. How will you do that? Now let's again remember that the main problem with trying to make glass is that it takes a very, very hot fire, and the resources to do that in the icy, wintry north, when just probably getting firewood's going to be annoying enough on its own, is going to be a very tall ask. If only the king in the north, who needs to rebuild these glass gardens, were to seduce someone who was carrying around 3 sources of very, very hot fire. Yeah, that's right. I think that they could use the dragons as essentially furnaces to potentially make enough glass to create new glass gardens where they could potentially rebirth the world tree, and this could potentially be one of the most key ways that the dragons come in actually important in solving the story in the end, right? Because I think that one of the things that George doesn't want is he doesn't want, like, the actual solution to be violence and war. So it would be very funny to turn these fire magic dragons from expecting to be this giant weapon of war that's going to be burning armies and armies of others, which they may still do that, but that probably won't solve the problem, right? Like, it'd be funny to watch them just burn armies and armies and armies, and it never solves the problem. And then the thing that actually solves the problem is taking this incredibly powerful source of energy and using it to build new things for society rather than, go fight wars. Like, I think that's kind of a thing that George wants to do with his story. He wants you to say that, like, hey, you have this power in the world, and you're using it for war, and that's always going to be pointless, and it's always going to lead to bad results. Stop doing that, and start using all of this power for things that benefit society, and look at how much better the problems get. So I think using the dragons to come and start rebuilding things, and planting new trees, is actually going to be the thing that's important. Daenerys constantly uses the idea of planting new trees and watching them grow to represent building a good society for her to rule over. She talks about this in Meereen, and she talks about it in the desert to, like, a vision version of Jorah, where she's just saying, hey, I just wanted to plant new trees and watch them grow. And the vision tells her, dragons plant no trees. Remember who you are. And she starts, like, getting more motivated to turn to fire and blood is the idea. And I've talked about this briefly in other videos, but I think one of the key things our characters are going to have to overcome is the nature of their own destiny, their own family lines, right? Like, Bran is going to have to throw away the power source that has had House Stark in power for the last 10,000 years, just as Daenerys is going to have to overcome things like dragons plant no trees. She's going to have to literally go and plant this tree and not embrace her fiery, destructive potential, right? That's the idea. They have to overcome and do better than their ancestors to build these new ways. So, if Daenerys ends up using the dragons in an effort to help plant trees by the end of the story, that would, in my opinion, be on some level a very large character victory for Daenerys in overcoming a lot of these circumstances that she thought were, like, the things that were on her side, right? It's her Targaryen heritage that's going to make her powerful. It's all of this. And it's like, well, in the end, no, it's your actions, Daenerys. It's the fact that you chose to try and make a better world, no matter what happens, even when that went against your Targaryen traditions and heritage. You chose to do the right thing. And I think that will be one of the struggles, or one of the main things that our characters have to all try to do, is overcoming this pull, this feeling that they should act a certain way because of who they are. So yeah, I'm not saying we're not going to get a big climactic end times type battle beforehand. We may get an entire book of the dragons burning the White Walkers before they realize that it's all pointless until they can settle down, rebuild, and plant a new tree. And if they do indeed use the dragons to blow new glass for the glass gardens of Winterfell, it would be kind of funny that George the entire time has been suggesting that the way to defeat the others is dragon glass. Because he was talking about obsidian, but he was actually also potentially talking about dragon glass.
And we can destroy them with dragon glass.
As in glass blown by the dragons to repair the glass gardens to actually solve the problem, which is why I would like to officially dub this the Dragon Glass Gardens of Winterfell theory, the idea that they are going to use the dragon fire to repair the glass gardens, and that's going to be central to the endgame of the story, which I think would be very funny if George has set up these dragons as this giant weapon of war, and the only actually really important thing that they do in the end is essentially infrastructure development, destroying old infrastructure, replacing it with new, better infrastructure. I think that would be a very funny thing for George to do in the end, and he'll probably give us our big climactic battle beforehand anyway, and we'll just have to realize, oh, that was exciting, but pointless. That's not how you solve the problems. In the end, you solve the problems by building a better world for people and trying to use power in ways that are constructive for society. And just a final couple points that I noticed in the editing, I do want to just say the way that I think this would probably play out is that the infrastructure rebuilding happens before the Long Night falls on some level, right? Like if they try to have a period where they're trying to rebuild Winterfell, and Daenerys is then arriving or becomes involved when they're settled there, before everything goes completely insane, they may have a period of trying to repair things, and this could be when they would rebuild the glass gardens for winter, and then not until later, after they have gone through their period of fighting shadows and trying to burn the White Walkers, and realizing that it's just not really making any progress, then they will eventually realize that, oh hey, this infrastructure development that we did was actually the important thing the whole time, right? It's not like they're going to be in the middle of the long night and then turn around and be like, oh, what if we repaired the greenhouse in the middle of all this fighting? I think it'd probably be the other way around. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is that weirwoods behave much more like a fungus than a tree in a lot of ways, and don't actually seem to require direct light to grow, so it could be a situation where, even if they're in the dead of the long night and the sun has gone away completely, if they have had the greenhouse rebuilt already, it's actually just going to be a heated place where the ground is soft enough to just plant the thing and let it actually take root, and the dragons might even be useful in heating the place because the heating system in Winterfell is broken, and it may have even relied upon the old world tree to be functioning, so the dragons that Dany has might be there as literally like the heat source to try and keep the glass gardens warm, and in the end that could be their most beneficial role to the world and the building of the new world tree. Now, this is definitely a topic that will be coming up in future videos as we continue to explore the potential ways that this series could end, but that is where I'm going to have to cut things off here for today. Let me know what you think about that down in the comments. Let me know what you think of the Dragon Glass Gardens of Winterfell theory, and if you found the video enjoyable, make sure you hit like, subscribe before you go, and share it with someone else who might enjoy it. I'll be back with something else very soon.